I was positioned behind the rearmost pew at my husband's funeral, observing a woman I didn't recognize shed more tears than I. She occupied a seat in the front row. The church was filled with the scent of lilies and polished wood. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting vibrant halos of color across the pews. Soft whispers circulated as people dabbed their eyes with tissues, the occasional sniffle punctuating the quiet. Yet, I wasn't crying. I hadn't shed a tear since the morning I learned Arthur was gone. I had no tears remaining. I stood isolated at the back of the church, clad in a black dress that no longer fit as it once did. My hands gripped my purse handle so tightly my knuckles were white, the corner of a neatly folded, unused tissue peeking out. Then I noticed her, in the front row to the right of the pulpit, a woman easily 2 decades my junior with long dark curly hair and a slender black dress that seemed meticulously chosen. She wept so intensely her shoulders shook. Her hands quivered as she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. An usher leaned over to pat her shoulder comfortingly, as if she were the grieving widow, as if she were me. She never looked around. She never once glanced behind her. She sat with the assurance of someone who felt entitled to that seat right beside where I should have been, right where I had sat every Sunday morning next to Arthur for decades. Except now, I wasn't even mentioned in the service program. No one truly acknowledged me. A few individuals nodded civilly as they passed, while others whispered, uncertain whether to address me. I wasn't on the attendee list. I hadn't arranged this service. I hadn't even been invited to offer a few words. Arthur's partner at the medical practice had managed everything. Our daughter, Olivia, believed it was for the best, saying I needed to rest, that I shouldn't be burdened. But I understood the real reason. They simply didn't want me to spoil the idealized farewell everyone had constructed for Arthur. Nevertheless, I attended. I had to witness for myself who would appear, who would occupy the front row. And now I knew. As the priest cleared his throat and approached the microphone, the organ music softened and then ceased. The murmurs subsided. The woman in the front row delicately blew her nose and straightened her posture, regaining her composure. She appeared as though she had rehearsed this role, the grieving something or other. I watched her with a quiet sense of disbelief. I knew my husband harbored secrets. I just hadn't anticipated that one of them would be sobbing beside his coffin while I stood like an uninvited guest. Then Father Michael, our priest for many years, the very man who had officiated our wedding, surveyed the congregation. His gaze met mine for a fleeting second, then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. I initially thought I might have imagined it. He spoke into the microphone, his voice serene and distinct. Before we commence, Arthur's wife Evelyn has requested I share a few words on her behalf. And just like that, the entire church turned. Dozens of heads slowly pivoted towards the rear of the room. Some individuals gasped, others appeared bewildered. A few looked ashamed. Even Chloe, yes, I now knew her name, turned and her eyes locked with mine, her mouth slightly agape, her tear-streaked face filled with shock. And I remained there, still clutching my purse, still enveloped in silence, but this time I was no longer invisible. Before we begin, please let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more compelling narratives. Before everything fractured, before the silence and the falsehoods, there was a period when I believed my life was complete. Arthur and I met at a university social in Michigan in the late 70s. He was in medical school, brimming with sharp ambition, and I was studying early childhood education. He remarked that I had sunshine in my voice after I correctly answered a trivia question about state capitals. I chuckled, thinking it was the most hackneyed line I'd ever encountered, yet I remembered it. We married 2 years later in a quaint chapel adorned with white ribbons on the pews, and my sister Claire sang a slightly discordant version of Amazing Grace. We possessed very little. My bouquet came from the local supermarket, and our honeymoon was a borrowed cottage in the Poconos. But I felt wealthy. I felt chosen. In the initial years, we were a partnership. I supported him through his demanding residency, diligently clipping coupons and making every dollar stretch. I accepted substitute teaching positions wherever available and prepared meals that could extend over 3 days. He would return home smelling of antiseptic and profound fatigue, collapse onto the sofa, and I would rub his back without him needing to ask. When Olivia was born, our small world expanded. She was the center of his universe, or so I believed. He established a pediatric practice from the ground up, and I returned to teaching on a part-time basis. I adored being a mother, a wife, the quiet strength supporting his success. We had our customs. Every Sunday, we'd sit on the porch with mugs of coffee and complete the crossword puzzle together. He always attempted to finish before me, even though I typically won. I baked zucchini bread weekly. He cherished the aroma. He invariably left his shoes in the hallway, and I consistently moved them. Each time I convinced myself this was the manifestation of love. After 30 years, it wasn't a romantic fantasy, but it was ours. When Arthur launched his own clinic, I designed the waiting room. Walls painted a soft cerulean, white chairs, a small aquarium in the corner. He said it made patients feel at ease. He told me I possessed a teacher's knack with people, that my mere presence improved things. And I believed him. I genuinely did. He was never the overtly romantic sort. We didn't indulge in roses or spontaneous weekend trips, but he was reliable, steadfast. He came home every evening, paid the bills punctually, and never raised his voice. So, when he forgot our anniversary 1 year, I dismissed it. When he began working increasingly long hours, I rationalized it as the price of success, and when he hadn't touched me for 3 consecutive months, I attributed it to menopause. I even blamed myself, but I clung to the life we shared. I hosted Thanksgiving annually. Claire would lament that the turkey was too dry, and Arthur would wink at me across the table as if we shared an inside joke. On Christmas mornings, he'd sit in his robe with coffee while Liv unwrapped presents, and I'd pretend we were still the family I had always envisioned. He never struck me, never strayed, or so I thought. He never made me feel insecure, merely unobserved. But when you're married to someone for over 35 years, the absence of overt cruelty can begin to resemble love. I mistook his reticence for tranquility. I mistook his routines for unwavering devotion. The older we became, the more withdrawn he grew. We consumed dinner in silence most nights, watching the news as we ate. He never inquired about my book club. I ceased asking about his patients. We coexisted like pieces of furniture. Still, I didn't voice any complaints. I told my friends I was fortunate that we'd outlasted so many others, that marriage wasn't intended to remain perpetually exciting. I was so convinced we were stable, secure, the type of couple who finishes each other's sentences at the grocery store, the kind people admired for making their relationship endure. I imagined we'd gracefully transition into retirement together, embark on that Mediterranean cruise we often discussed, perhaps even acquire a small dog. But in the quietude, something was eroding, and I failed to notice it. Or perhaps I chose not to, because when you construct your entire life around someone for decades, you don't actively search for flaws. You paint over them. You tell yourself it's merely age, merely stress, merely life. I didn't realize then that I was loving a man who had already started to leave me, one quiet day at a time. The initial fissure wasn't loud. It was barely perceptible, the sort of thing you dismiss and forget unless you're looking back with newfound clarity. It occurred 2 summers past. I recall because it was the same day we hosted Liv's birthday dinner. She had just turned 32 and brought over a bottle of Cabernet and a new boyfriend. We were under strict instructions not to interrogate. Arthur grilled ribeyes and I baked key lime pie. The house smelled of garlic and thyme. For a few hours we felt like a typical family once more. That evening, after everyone had departed and I was rinsing the wine glasses, Arthur's phone vibrated. He was seated at the kitchen table, sifting through the mail. Without conscious thought, I glanced down and saw the screen illuminate. The contact name simply read, "C, nothing more." A heart emoji followed it. The message preview stated, "Missed you today. Hope you're well. Call when you can." I dried my hands on a dish towel and inquired, "Who's C?" He barely looked up. "Just someone from the clinic. She manages appointments, Chloe." The way he uttered her name, flat, devoid of emotion, didn't align with the warmth of the message. I attempted a smile, but a disquieting sensation stirred in my stomach. "That's a personal message, not about appointments," I remarked, trying to maintain a light tone. He shrugged. "She checks in on everyone. She's just amiable. You're overthinking it." I wanted to believe him. I desperately needed to believe him, so I let the matter drop. That was the pivotal moment, the one where a part of me sensed something was amiss, but I suppressed it like a loose thread in a garment I wasn't prepared to unravel. I admonished myself not to be the paranoid wife, not to succumb to bitterness or suspicion after decades of steadfast loyalty. Besides, Arthur wasn't the type. He wasn't impulsive or charming or flirtatious. He was consistent, predictable. Nevertheless, over the ensuing weeks, I observed him texting more discreetly, with the screen angled away. He started taking his phone into the bathroom, a habit he'd never had before. Once I entered the room, and he hastily placed it face down on the armrest. He smiled too quickly. I began to overcompensate. I prepared his favorite dishes. I dressed a little more stylishly when he returned from work. I even purchased new bed linens, a soft percale blend he used to admire. He didn't seem to notice. I suggested a weekend getaway, just the two of us. Perhaps we could visit the cottage in the Berkshires, I proposed, pouring him coffee one morning. He didn't even lift his gaze from his phone. "I have too much going on at the clinic. Maybe later." Maybe later, maybe later, maybe later. That became his standard response to everything. One night, I inadvertently left my phone charging in his study, and when I went to retrieve it, I noticed his laptop was open. An email was displayed on the screen. It was a promotional newsletter for a resort in Sonoma Valley, a romantic destination. I stared at it, bewildered. We hadn't embarked on a trip like that in years, and he'd never mentioned any such plans. When I questioned him about it later, he said, "Oh, someone at the office was discussing it. I just looked it up. No big deal. That's how all of it felt. Minor things, innocuous things, tiny shifts that, in isolation, seemed excusable. But then came the perfume. He arrived home late one evening, claiming he'd been summoned for an emergency consultation. I hugged him as he walked past, and there it was. Not cologne, not the sterile scent of the clinic, but something floral, sweet, and distinctly not mine. "Did someone spray something at the office?" I asked, forcing a smile. He frowned. "I don't know. The waiting room always smells like scented candles or something." "Why?" I shook my head. "Just curious." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to his even breathing beside me, and I wondered for the first time in 37 years precisely who I had married. Yet still, I said nothing. I didn't want to believe what I already suspected, because once you voice a suspicion aloud, it gains reality, and I wasn't prepared for the truth to become real just yet. Well, you don't always perceive the ground shifting beneath your feet until you're already brought to your knees. That's how it commenced with Arthur and me. Not in a confrontation, not in some dramatic explosion, just a slow deterioration like watching wallpaper begin to peel from a corner, curling so subtly you dismiss it as nothing until the entire wall starts to give way. The man for whom I had once prepared blueberry pancakes every Sunday ceased coming home for breakfast. Initially, he attributed it to the clinic, too many early appointments, an increased patient load. I nodded in the manner of a dutiful wife. I even packed him fruit salads and handwritten notes some mornings, thinking perhaps he merely needed a reminder of home. The notes went unacknowledged, the fruit returned untouched. Eventually, I stopped packing them entirely. Conversations dwindled. He began responding to my inquiries with partial shrugs or weary sighs. Once, I recounted a story from my book club about a woman who discovered her resilience after her husband abandoned her. I waited for him to smile or offer an ironic comment, but all he said was, "Fiction is always over the top," and resumed scrolling on his tablet. We had transformed into silent cohabitants. I prepared dinner, he consumed it. We watched the evening news, he browsed his phone. When I chuckled at something the news anchor said, he didn't even look up. That used to be our shared activity, analyzing the evening news, devising witty remarks. Now he sat like a shadow beside me, present but inaccessible. One night, I asked if he wanted to take a walk with me, just around the neighborhood. He told me his knees were bothering him. The following night, it was his back. The night after that, he claimed he was simply too exhausted. A part of me wondered if I had done something wrong. Perhaps I was too unadorned. Perhaps I talked too excessively. Perhaps I had become tedious. I purchased a new blouse, a deep emerald silk, slightly more fitted than my usual attire. He didn't notice. I wore a crimson lipstick I hadn't used since Liv's graduation. He asked if I was feeling unwell. I tried everything except the one thing I dreaded most, asking him directly, because I knew if I asked, I'd shatter the illusion. And illusions, when you've constructed your entire identity around them, are exceedingly difficult to relinquish. The bedroom grew colder, not in temperature but emotionally. He extinguished the light before I could even settle into bed. He stopped reaching for me in the darkness. He used to sleep curled towards me, his hand resting gently on my hip. Now he remained on his side, his back turned, the blanket clutched tightly. And yet, he was never cruel, never unkind. He didn't yell, he didn't mock me, He simply vanished, not instantaneously but in slow, quiet increments. I remember dropping a plate one afternoon. It slipped from my grasp and shattered across the kitchen floor. I wept as I knelt to clean it up, the sound of the broom against the tile sharp and desolate. Arthur had just walked through the door. He saw the mess, saw my tears, and said nothing. He stepped over the broken fragments and went upstairs. It wasn't what he did that fractured me. It was what he ceased doing. He stopped asking about my day, stopped recounting his. He stopped taking my hand when we crossed the street or brushing my hair from my shoulder when we sat at dinner parties. I began to feel invisible in my own life, as if I were fading from the periphery inward. Even Liv noticed something on one occasion. "Dad seems preoccupied lately," she commented, pouring herself tea during one of her visits. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "He's just busy," I said. "The clinic has been demanding." She accepted that explanation. Why wouldn't she? I had taught her that love manifested as endurance, as silence, as bearing the weight of someone else's distance and pretending it didn't crush you. And so I endured. I stopped reaching for his hand, stopped anticipating goodnight kisses, stopped asking to be acknowledged. I told myself this was what aging together entailed, that love after so many years was quieter, more practical. But deep down I knew the truth. He wasn't merely tired. He wasn't merely distracted. He was already elsewhere, emotionally, spiritually, possibly even physically, with someone who reanimated him, and I had become part of the household furnishings. It transpired at the hospital fundraiser, a night I will never erase from my memory, not for its glamour or significance, but because I departed feeling as though I didn't exist. The clinic was hosting its annual charity gala, a black tie affair held at the downtown hotel ballroom. Arthur insisted I attend, even purchasing a new dress for me. It was sapphire blue, modest yet elegant, with lace sleeves and a simple pearl brooch at the collar. I recall looking at myself in the mirror that night and thinking, perhaps tonight we'll feel like a couple again. The ballroom was teeming with people, glittering with chandeliers and filled with the clinking of champagne flutes, physicians in tuxedos, board members in floor-length gowns. Arthur moved through the room with an air of ownership, shaking hands, exchanging laughter, complimenting individuals on their speeches before they had even delivered them. I followed at his side, smiling courteously, maintaining an upright posture. He never once reached for my hand. About 30 minutes into the event, he introduced me to someone. "This is Evelyn," he said with a cursory glance. "No, my wife." No warmth, just my name, as if I were the event caterer or someone who had merely accompanied him. I told myself not to take it personally. Perhaps he was nervous, perhaps he was preoccupied. And then she approached, Chloe Reynolds. She wore a deep claret dress that clung to her figure a little too closely for a hospital fundraiser. Her heels clicked like distinct punctuation marks as she traversed the marble floor. She carried a diminutive clutch and wore the kind of makeup that silently declared, "I've meticulously studied my angles in the mirror." Her lipstick precisely matched her dress. "Dr. Hammond," she said with a warm, familiar smile. She touched his arm, not a handshake but a gliding motion, her fingertips trailing from his wrist to his elbow as if it were a customary gesture. "You made it." He smiled, genuinely smiled. His entire countenance softened as if an internal light had been switched on. "I wouldn't miss it," he replied. She glanced at me, a mere flick of her eyes, no more than a second, then redirected her attention to Arthur. She began discussing table arrangements and donors, the two of them exchanging brief, private jokes as if they had rehearsed them. I stood there, clutching my purse with both hands, striving not to visibly diminish. At one point, Chloe laughed a bit too loudly and touched Arthur's lapel, adjusting it. "You always forget this," she remarked, like a wife who had performed the action 100 times before. He allowed her to in front of me, in front of everyone. I wanted to speak. I wanted to step forward and assert that I was his wife, that we had built a life together, that I knew every line on his hands and every scar on his back. But I didn't. I smiled, I nodded. I waited for him to remember my presence. He didn't. Someone called his name from across the room. Chloe offered to check on the seating chart, and he followed her. I remained like that, abandoned by the dessert table like a distant acquaintance. A few guests approached. "You must be so proud of Arthur," one of them said. "He and Chloe have been accomplishing such wonderful work at the clinic. She's truly been by his side through everything." I forced a smile. "Yes," I said, "she certainly has." I departed early, informed the valet I had a headache, and rode home alone in the quiet back seat of a taxi, still wearing that sapphire dress, the lace sleeve suddenly feeling scratchy and absurd. When I arrived home, I stood in the kitchen and stared at the counter for an extended period. Then I opened a bottle of wine, sat at the table, and poured myself a glass, not because I needed it, but because I yearned to feel something sharp, something tangible, something that reminded me I was still present. He returned 2 hours later, mentioned the fundraiser had gone well, said nothing about my early departure, said nothing about Chloe, merely kissed the top of my head as if I were an elderly aunt and proceeded upstairs. I realized in that moment that I wasn't losing my husband. I had already lost him. I was simply the last one to become aware of it. I didn't leave all at once. That would have been too neat, too straightforward. Instead, it was a gradual unraveling, thread by thread, day by day, until one morning I acknowledged I was no longer a part of the life I had helped construct. After the gala, something within me shifted. I ceased pretending. I stopped asking Arthur to share dinner with me, stopped waiting for him to return home at a reasonable hour. I still cooked, old habits are tenacious, but I began eating alone, lighting a candle solely for myself, pouring a single glass of wine. He'd arrive late, glance at the leftovers in the refrigerator, and head upstairs without a word. I never inquired about his day. He never asked about mine. The chasm between us was no longer measured in feet. It was measured in silence. A few weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon, he called me from the clinic. "I'm going to stay at the apartment near the hospital for a while," he stated, as if we had discussed it, as if it were a mutual decision. "What apartment?" I asked, endeavoring to keep my voice even. "It's just temporary, closer to work, less commuting. You know how late things often run these days." I sat down at the kitchen table. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the center of the table where we used to sit and laugh and plan birthday celebrations and grocery lists and holiday menus. I stared at the faded circle on the wood where his coffee cup habitually rested. "How long is a while?" I inquired. "I don't know, a few weeks, I suppose. We both need a little space." He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound remorseful. He sounded as if he were discussing the weather, as if this weren't a seismic shift, but a polite modification. I wanted to scream. "Who is she?" I wanted to demand explanations, but I refrained because some part of me already knew, and hearing it articulated would have shattered something I wasn't prepared to lose, even if it had been absent for a long time. So I said, "Okay." I assisted him with packing that night. I folded his shirts as he preferred, sleeves tucked, buttons fastened. I polished his shoes. I even placed his razor and toothbrush neatly into a small toiletry bag. He didn't touch me once. No hug, no kiss, goodbye. He walked out the door carrying a suitcase I had purchased for him years ago for a trip we never undertook. After he departed, I stood in the doorway for an extended period, gazing at the driveway. Then I went inside, closed the door, and cleaned the kitchen. I needed something to do, something mundane. I couldn't yet endure the silence. When Liv called later that week, I didn't tell her. She was preoccupied with work, planning a vacation with her boyfriend, complaining about deadlines. I let her talk, grateful for the sound. I smiled through the phone, assured her everything was fine, that her father was working late as usual. She didn't need to know her father had moved out. At night, I relocated to the guest room. Our bedroom smelled of him, and I couldn't bear it. I stripped the bed, laundered the sheets, and folded them into the linen closet as if attempting to store away the fragments of a life I no longer recognized. I stopped wearing my wedding ring initially only when I was cleaning or gardening. Then, one day, I forgot to put it back on and I didn't miss it. Friends began asking about Arthur's whereabouts. I told them he had a great deal going on at the clinic, that he needed rest, that he was traveling. The lies came effortlessly, not because I relished them, but because I couldn't yet face the pity I knew would accompany the truth. Claire, my older sister, finally visited. She surveyed the house, noticed the quietude, noticed the empty closet, and asked, "Is he gone?" I nodded. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't offer advice. She simply sat with me in the living room, both of us sipping tea, enveloped by the soft ticking of the wall clock. I didn't cry, not then, not in front of her, because when you've been slowly effaced, there's no explosion, no drama, just the quiet ache of absence. The knowledge that you lingered too long, hoping someone would remember you, and when they didn't, you packed their bags for them. The house was never truly silent when Arthur lived here. There was always the sound of his keys jingling as he entered, the soft creak of the bathroom cabinet he never fully closed, the late-night hum of his electric toothbrush, the sigh he emitted when he finally settled onto the couch, unbuttoning his collar after a long day. I used to consider those sounds ordinary. Now I missed them more than I was willing to admit. After he left, it didn't become silent. It became hollow, echoing. Even my own footsteps sounded unfamiliar, as if belonging to someone else. I recall one morning distinctly. It was raining, a cold, persistent drizzle that made the entire sky appear bruised. I awoke to the drip of water leaking from the corner of a window we never managed to repair. I walked downstairs barefoot, wrapped in a robe that still bore a faint scent of lavender, and turned on the kettle. I reached for 2 mugs instinctively, poured water into both, then I stared at the second mug as if it had betrayed me. I stood there, frozen, watching the steam ascend, my hand hovering above the handle until, finally, I poured its contents down the drain. That was the day I realized I no longer had anyone for whom to make coffee. I had no one to converse with in the mornings, no one to ask if I looked presentable before leaving the house, no one to complain to about the price of milk or my stiff joints, or the way the neighbor's terrier never ceased barking. I was alone, and not in the serene, restful manner people romanticize. I was alone in a way that rendered every meal a burden, in a way that compelled me to leave the radio on merely to hear a voice, in a way that made me stare at walls and ponder when, precisely, my life had ceased to belong to me. I started sleeping excessively, 10, sometimes 12 hours a night. I skipped breakfast. I'd sit at the kitchen table and scroll through old photographs on my phone. Arthur at Liv's graduation, Arthur carving the Thanksgiving turkey, Arthur at the beach in that absurd straw hat he refused to discard, always smiling, always appearing like the man I believed would grow old alongside me. One afternoon, I found myself in the attic, sifting through a dusty container of our wedding mementos. I held our photo album in my lap and turned each page more slowly than I ever had before. There was one picture, me in my mother's pearl earrings, Arthur leaning in to kiss my cheek, both of us radiant with something I now recognized as naivete. I touched the photo as if I could feel it, as if I could re-enter it and halt time before everything went awry. But you can't touch memories, not truly. You can only allow them to sting. Eventually, I stopped opening the mail. Bills accumulated on the entryway console. I let the garden run wild, the roses wilted, and I didn't prune them. I couldn't summon the energy to care. Even Liv's phone calls began to feel like another reminder of everything I had failed to safeguard. She asked if I wanted to come stay with her for a while. I told her I was fine. I always said I was fine. She had no idea I'd been wearing the same cardigan for 3 days. My nada wasn't a scream. It wasn't some public meltdown. It was standing in my kitchen one evening, consuming dried crackers for dinner and realizing I hadn't spoken to another human being in 2 full days. It was looking in the mirror and not recognizing the woman staring back. Her hair uncombed, her eyes lackluster, her shoulders slumped like someone who had forgotten how to stand upright. I whispered, "This isn't me." Not as a declaration, but as a question, because I no longer knew who I was without Arthur, without the role of wife, of caregiver, of someone else's something. I had spent so long being the backdrop to his spotlight that when he exited the frame, all that remained was silence and an outline of the woman I used to be. It commenced with a knock at the door. I wasn't anticipating anyone. It was a Wednesday morning, overcast and sluggish, and I was still in my dressing gown, sipping lukewarm tea in the living room. The knock sounded again, firm, businesslike. I hesitated, then opened the door to discover a courier holding a padded envelope. "Evelyn Hammond?" he inquired. I nodded. "Signature required, please." I signed. He handed it to me and departed without another word. There was no return address on the envelope, merely Arthur's name scribbled in the corner. My hands grew rigid. I brought it inside, placed it on the dining room table, and stared at it for a considerable time. I didn't want to open it, but I did. Inside was a slim, rectangular jewelry box, the kind one receives from upscale boutiques. Beneath it, a small handwritten card with crisp, neat lettering that was definitively not mine. "To the woman who brought me peace when I thought I'd never find it. I love you, A." I opened the box. It contained a gold necklace, a delicate heart-shaped pendant adorned with tiny emeralds around the edge, and engraved across the center in elegant cursive was a name I didn't recognize. Chloe. The room seemed to tilt. I sat down, the card trembling in my hand. I read it repeatedly, as if the words might magically rearrange themselves into something innocuous, something explicable. But there was no mistaking it. This was intended for her. She brought him peace, not me. Not the woman who held his hand in hospital waiting rooms, who stood in the drenching rain to deliver forgotten lunches, who sacrificed sleep to reattach buttons on his shirts. She brought him peace. I dropped the card on the table as if it had seared my skin. For a few seconds I couldn't draw breath. My ears rang, my stomach churned. Then I stood, walked to the sink and splashed cold water on my face. I didn't weep, not immediately. Instead, I roamed the house like a phantom. I looked at our wedding photograph on the mantelpiece, at the framed picture of us and Liv in front of the National Park sign. I looked at the mug he always used, world's best father, and the indentation in the sofa cushion where he used to sit every evening with his feet propped up. Suddenly everything appeared staged, artificial, a museum exhibit of a marriage that no longer existed. Perhaps it never truly did. I returned to the envelope and examined the postmark. It had been mailed 2 days before Arthur's death, 2 days before he collapsed in his office and never regained consciousness. He had been planning to give this to her, and somehow, through either mischance or destiny, it had ended up in my possession. I held the necklace up by its chain, watching it sway in the morning light. It glittered like something sacred, and I detested it for its beauty. I detested that it held more affection than I had experienced in years. I detested that he had found someone else to confide in, someone else to admire, someone else to truly see him. But even more than all that, I detested that I still loved him. I concealed the necklace at the back of the kitchen drawer, beneath spare batteries and outdated takeout menus. I didn't discard it. I wasn't prepared to destroy it. Not yet. I needed to feel its presence like a persistent bruise I kept pressing. The betrayal wasn't solely in the infidelity. It was in the deliberate effort. He had selected a gift, penned a card, made plans for her. He hadn't done anything comparable for me in years. That night, I sat in the dimness with only a single lamp illuminated, rereading old journals I hadn't touched in a decade. Back when I used to document things, small moments, amusing things, Liv said, thoughts I was too reticent to voice aloud. Sifting through those pages, I discovered an old entry from our 25th anniversary. He's distant lately, but perhaps it's just work. I keep trying. I just want him to notice me again. Even then, I was fading. But this necklace, this gift not meant for me, was the definitive proof, the tangible manifestation of everything I had suspected and suppressed for years. It hurt, yes, but it also initiated something because now I knew I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't insecure or paranoid. I was betrayed. And knowing the truth, holding it in my hands meant I no longer had to wonder. Now I could finally decide what to do with the truth, and with myself. The necklace remained in the drawer, yet I thought of it daily. It lay buried beneath a miscellany of trivial items, rubber bands, old rolls of tape, expired coupons, but its presence resonated beneath it all, a quiet reminder that the woman my husband loved at the end of his life was not me. Curiously, however, it didn't crush me as I had anticipated. The betrayal stung undeniably. The ache of being supplanted, of being invisible, still lingered. But in the ensuing days, something unforeseen began to take hold. Not fury, not despair, but a profound clarity. The kind that emerges only after a prolonged darkness, when your eyes adjust and you begin to perceive what was always present. I started with minor adjustments. I made coffee to my own preference, strong, with a dash of almond milk and nutmeg. Arthur always said nutmeg made it taste too cloying. I added an extra sprinkle merely to spite his memory. I cleared out his side of the wardrobe, folded his shirts, and packed them into boxes. One by one, each garment reminded me of a missed dinner, a falsehood told, a silence maintained. I didn't weep. I simply folded, bagged, labeled, donate. In the corner of the wardrobe, I discovered a dusty shoebox filled with ticket stubs from medical conferences, handwritten notes from patients, and, surprisingly, a few old birthday cards from me. I opened one. To my steadfast anchor, I couldn't accomplish any of this without you, Arthur. I stared at the words for a while, attempting to recall the man who had penned them, trying to determine if he had ever meant them or if they had merely become part of the charade of a long deteriorating marriage. I didn't tear it up, nor did I keep it. I slipped it into the recycling bin with the other forgotten paper memories. Then I took a walk. It wasn't a symbolic, cinematic stroll just around the neighborhood, but I moved slowly, deliberately, as if relearning how to inhabit my own body. The air was cool, crisp. I passed the Petersons' yard, still excessively adorned with wind chimes and ceramic gnomes. I waved at Mrs. Henderson, who sat on her porch knitting. She waved back, and for the first time in months I didn't feel self-conscious being seen alone. I stopped by the park, sat on a bench, and watched dogs run in exuberant circles. I listened to strangers laugh and shout and exist independently of me, and I realized something. The world had continued to turn while I was grieving a man who had already moved on, and it would continue to turn even now. When I returned home, I opened a blank notebook, one I'd purchased years ago with the intention of resuming journaling, but had always left untouched. I wrote a single sentence. I am still here. That was all. I closed the notebook and left it on the kitchen counter. That night, I cooked for myself, not something quick or frozen, but real food. Cod with dill and lemon, roasted new potatoes, steamed asparagus. I lit a candle, sat at the table with a cloth napkin and a glass of wine. It wasn't for anyone else. No one was observing. I wasn't attempting to impress. I did it because I deserved to feel that I mattered. After dinner, I opened the jewelry box again. The necklace gleamed up at me, unrepentant. I didn't cry. Instead, I took it outside and buried it beneath the lilac bush that Arthur had once promised to transplant, a promise he never fulfilled. I pressed the soil down firmly with my bare hands. There was no ceremony, no dramatic farewell, just a quiet acknowledgement that this belonged to someone else, and I no longer needed to bear its weight. In the days that followed, I found myself standing taller, moving with a different gait. I called Claire and invited her to lunch. I joined an online grief support forum. I retrieved my old sketch pads and purchased new charcoal pencils. One morning, as I was brushing my hair, I looked in the mirror and saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Me. Not a wife, not a scorned woman, not the runner-up in someone else's love story, just me. I wasn't healed yet, not even close, but for the first time in a considerable period, I was no longer sinking. I was standing. I didn't make any grand announcements. Not to Liv, not to Claire, not to the friends who occasionally called to check in, their voices tinged with pity. I didn't even confide in the mirror. I simply began to act differently. The first step I took was visiting the bank. I sat opposite a young woman in a smart blazer who persistently addressed me as Mrs. Hammond until I gently corrected her. Just Evelyn is fine. I updated my personal accounts, removed Arthur's name from every document that still bore it, rerouted my pension deposits, and closed a joint savings account I had forgotten we even possessed. I didn't weep. I didn't hesitate. I signed the forms, thanked the woman for her assistance, and walked out into the sunlight, feeling 10 pounds lighter. Next came the solicitor. It felt peculiar stepping into that office, the same one where Arthur and I had once drafted our wills. Back then, we had sat side by side discussing Liv's future, who would inherit the house, what to do if we were ever incapacitated. I recall how adamant he was about not burdening Liv with responsibility, how readily I had concurred. Now I sat alone. "I'd like to revise my will," I informed the solicitor, a kind-eyed woman in her 50s named Patricia, "and I'd like Arthur's name removed as my power of attorney." She didn't bat an eyelid. She simply nodded and opened a fresh file. We conversed for an hour. I told her I wanted everything to go to Olivia, with a small portion allocated to a scholarship fund, something I had once envisioned establishing after retirement. Patricia asked if there were any specific personal effects I wished to designate. I thought about the necklace I'd buried, about the house, about the recipes I still hadn't transcribed for Liv. "Yes," I said, "there's a box of letters in my wardrobe. They're mine. I'd like them returned to my daughter, unopened, if anything should happen to me." She made a note. I walked out of that office not as Arthur's widow, not as someone partially erased, but as a woman who now fully owned every part of her narrative. Back home, I commenced decluttering, not in some furious, vengeful purge, but as if preparing for something better. I packed away old photo frames displaying Arthur's face, not because I wished to forget, but because I wanted to remember differently. I cleared out drawers, donated the suits he had left behind, and gave away the books he never finished reading. In the evenings, I lit candles, not for mourning, but for tranquility. I started a small personal project digitizing old family photographs, labeling them so Olivia wouldn't have to guess their significance one day. It felt like reclaiming history, piecing together my identity beyond the confines of wifehood. I also visited the clinic's website. There on the staff directory was Chloe's photograph, smiling, polished, her title listed as Executive Coordinator to Dr. Hammond. I stared at it for a considerable time, not with hatred, but with clarity. I didn't contact her, didn't send a letter, or seek a confrontation. I didn't need her to know that I knew, but I did quietly get in touch with the clinic's accountant, a man named Stewart, whom I'd met a few times at functions. I posed a few questions regarding Arthur's accounts, the business insurance, the future of the practice. He was cautious initially, but respectful. "You have a right to know these things, Evelyn," he finally said. "Let me get some paperwork initiated." I wasn't planning retribution. I was reclaiming my footing, my name, my presence. Every action I took was deliberate, quiet. There were no loud declarations, no social media announcements about starting anew, just a series of small, potent choices made behind closed doors. I resumed journaling, not about Arthur, not even about grief, but about minor observations. How the garden appeared that morning, a recipe I wanted to try, a memory of Olivia laughing in the back seat of our old estate car. And I began saving. I canceled unnecessary subscriptions, established a budget, and opened a high-yield savings account. I didn't yet know what I was saving for, but it felt gratifying to be building something again, even if it was merely a sense of control. No one noticed the changes, but I did. and that was sufficient because the most profound transformations don't occur with fanfare. They happen in kitchens at dawn, in solicitors' offices during quiet walks around the block, in deliberate acts of self-preservation. This wasn't revenge, it was resurrection. The shift didn't materialize with the slam of a door or a shouting confrontation. It occurred in the subtle manner the atmosphere changes before a storm, silent, charged, undeniable. Arthur died 6 weeks after I received the necklace. It was a Wednesday. I remember because I had just returned from the post office and was baking an apple crumble. The phone rang, an unknown number. I almost allowed it to go to voicemail. Something within me, some final connection to our shared history, compelled me to answer. "Mrs. Hammond?" a voice inquired. "Yes, this is Officer Davies from the Meadowbrook Police Department. I'm calling to inform you that your husband, Dr. Arthur Hammond, was found unresponsive in his office this afternoon. Paramedics attempted to resuscitate him, but he passed away at the scene. I'm so sorry for your loss." There was a pause, not from him, but from me. I didn't cry, I didn't collapse. I just stood in the middle of my kitchen, still holding the spoon I'd used to stir the crumble topping. It was dripping onto the counter, sugary and slow. The man who had erased me from his life was gone. I thanked the officer, hung up, and stared at the apple-stained countertop. I anticipated grief would come rushing in, but it didn't, not in the way it had the first time he departed. This grief felt like observing a stranger's house burn down. I didn't desire for it to happen, but I couldn't forget how cold I had felt within those walls. The following day, Liv called, frantic. "Mom, I just heard. Are you okay? I didn't even know he was still working so hard. When was the last time you saw him?" I lied. "A few weeks ago. The truth was, I hadn't seen him since he moved out. He never once attempted to visit, not even on my birthday, and now I would never see him again." The funeral arrangements commenced immediately, except I wasn't consulted. Chloe, it transpired, held power of attorney for medical decisions and had coordinated with the clinic to host a memorial service in one of the large chapels downtown. When I called the director to confirm, he said, "Oh, I assumed she was the spouse." I didn't correct him, not then. Instead, I called my solicitor. "Patricia, I need you to send a certified copy of the will to the funeral home and to Father Michael. There's something they need to be aware of." She paused. "Are you certain you want to do that?" "I'm certain." The morning of the funeral, I arrived alone. I didn't sit at the front. I stood at the back, just as I had intended. I wore the same black lace dress I had worn to the gala, but this time it fit differently, not tighter or looser, simply stronger. When Chloe walked in, head held high, dressed like the Empress of Sorrow, I observed the way people gravitated towards her. They whispered condolences, placed hands on her back. She performed the role flawlessly, even dabbing her eyes with a fresh white handkerchief. I felt a strange sort of pity for her. She didn't know what was about to happen. Father Michael stepped up to the lectern. The murmurs subsided. He welcomed everyone, spoke briefly about Arthur's accomplishments, and then paused. "There is something I've been asked to read," he announced, "at the request of Arthur's legal spouse, Evelyn Hammond." The silence was instantaneous. Heads turned. I saw Chloe. Her posture stiffened, the color drained from her face. Then he opened the envelope I'd handed him that morning. Inside was the revised will. The sole beneficiary named was me. All assets, including the Meadowbrook Pediatric Clinic, are to be transferred to Mrs. Evelyn Hammond. He read, "This includes financial accounts, property, and any intellectual ownership of the practice." He folded the paper, looked out over the pews, and added gently, "In accordance with Dr. Hammond's own signature, witnessed and notarized." I didn't move. I didn't smile. I just stood there, steady. Chloe turned slowly, her eyes wide. Our gazes met for the first time. She didn't utter a word. She didn't need to. The room felt different now. The atmosphere belonged to me again, not because I had seized anything, but because I had finally stopped relinquishing it all. After the priest concluded reading Arthur's will, a prolonged hush descended upon the chapel like a dense fog. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain of what to say or where to direct their gaze. Chloe remained frozen in the front pew, still clutching her handkerchief, her lips slightly parted. I didn't move, not immediately. I stood at the rear, allowing the silence to extend just long enough for the unease to fully blossom. Then I stepped forward. Each footfall echoed against the marble floor as if the room were collectively holding its breath. I didn't hasten. I didn't falter. I had waited sufficiently long. When I reached the front, I turned to face the congregation. Familiar faces stared back at me. Colleagues from the hospital, old friends from our neighborhood, even a few of Liv's childhood teachers. All of them had presumed I would recede into the background. Today I hadn't intended to speak, but after the reading of the will, the moment felt incomplete. Father Michael stepped aside with an understanding nod. I approached the lectern. I had no notes. I required none. "My name is Evelyn Hammond," I began, my voice calm and distinct. "For those of you who may not know, I was married to Arthur for over 40 years. A few heads lowered, others stiffened. We built a life together, a quiet one, not flawless, but enduring. We raised a daughter, we established a home, and for most of that time, I believed we were precisely what we appeared to be: stable, respectful, dependable." I paused and looked down at my hands resting on the edges of the lectern. "But sometimes the life you believe you've constructed turns out to be a narrative only one of you was recounting." I didn't look at Chloe, though I sensed her eyes on me, still tense as if bracing for an impact. "I am not here to disparage Arthur's name. He was a proficient doctor, a respected man. But like all individuals, he was also complex. And in the final years of his life, he made choices that inflicted pain on others." A cough broke the silence somewhere in the back. I spent a considerable amount of time questioning whether I should be angry, whether I should harbor hatred for him or her or myself for not perceiving it sooner. But grief isn't always vociferous. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's merely waking up each day and choosing to continue when no one seems to notice you've vanished. A man in the front row, Arthur's old golfing companion, wiped his eyes. I continued. "I didn't plan this moment. I didn't anticipate standing here. But when I discovered what he'd left behind, not just legally but emotionally, I realized I had a choice. I could remain silent and diminished, or I could reclaim the space I once so freely relinquished." Now I looked at Chloe. She didn't flinch. "You may have known a version of Arthur I never had the opportunity to see," I said. "You may have been a part of his life that he never shared with me. But I was his wife, and for better or worse, I supported him in sickness and in health, through disappointments and late nights and forgotten anniversaries. I gave more than I should have, and for a long time I believed that made me weak." I offered a faint smile. But it didn't. It made me whole because I loved with everything I possessed, even when it wasn't reciprocated. I stepped back from the lectern. I am not here to solicit sympathy. I don't require applause. I simply want my voice to be present in this room because I was here. I was always here. With that, I turned and walked back down the aisle. As I passed Chloe, I saw her wide, glistening, red-rimmed eyes, not with grief, but with shame. She didn't speak. She didn't follow me. I reached the back of the chapel and quietly resumed my seat. No one clapped, no one needed to. Because silence, for once, was not erasure, it was respect. The funeral concluded without a word from Chloe. She didn't approach me. She didn't attempt to explain. She departed swiftly, her heels clicking like an accusation as she disappeared through the side door, her place in Arthur's life suddenly appearing far less permanent. I remained behind, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. Closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's simply allowing yourself to be the last one in the room. The chapel emptied gradually. Friends and strangers murmured kind words, none of which I truly processed. People said I was brave, strong, elegant, but what I felt was clarity. For the first time in years, I didn't feel confused about my position in my own story. Later that week, I received a telephone call from Stuart, the clinic's accountant. He had been reviewing the business file since Arthur's passing and had something to show me. There were some discrepancies, he said, tapping a folder on his desk. You'll want to see this. I sat down. He opened the file and pushed it towards me. Inside were printouts of account withdrawals, unauthorized expense reports, and clinic reimbursements, all linked to personal charges made by Chloe, spa treatments, jewelry, a weekend getaway to Napa Valley booked under Arthur's name but financed by the clinic. And tucked into the back was an employment contract that had never been formally signed or approved, the one Chloe had been using to assert she was owed severance. She was never officially on the payroll, Stuart stated. Arthur never filed the correct paperwork. Technically, she was volunteering. There's no legal connection. I sat very still, and he added, The board has already reviewed this. They're incensed. They want her dismissed, and they want you to decide how to manage the transition. Just like that, the power dynamic shifted again, only this time fully and legally into my hands. I'd like her removed immediately, I said, my voice calm but firm. I don't wish for a confrontation, just a clean, quiet departure. He nodded. It will be done. Do you want to press charges? I looked at the folder, the receipts, the fabricated titles, all the pilfered pieces of a life I never consented to share. No, I said. Let her go. Let her explain it to her next prospective employer. He smiled faintly, understanding. 2 days later, Chloe was escorted out of the clinic, not by police, not with drama, but with quiet precision. A private meeting, a security guard waiting by the door. Her name was removed from the clinic website before dusk. I never saw her again. That same week, I made one more decision. The clinic, Arthur's pride, his legacy, the one place I had once helped paint and decorate, would be sold. But not to just anyone. I found a group of female physicians, younger, intelligent, and community-oriented, who had been endeavoring to open their own pediatric practice but were struggling to secure funding. I met with them, toured the premises, and saw their eyes light up. I sold it to them for $1. They initially thought it was a jest. It's not charity, I explained. It's a fresh start. Utilize it well. They wept. I didn't. That building had harbored so much of my pain. It had been the backdrop to secrets, to betrayals, to whispers I was never meant to hear. Letting it go felt like exhaling after holding my breath for far too many years. When the paperwork was finalized, I stood outside the clinic for a considerable time. The sign still read Hammond Pediatrics, but in a few weeks it would be altered. New name, new hands, new narrative. I ran my fingers along the brick, then turned and walked away. That was the twist. Not vengeance, not destruction, but reclamation. Chloe didn't receive what she believed she would inherit. Arthur's carefully guarded secrets didn't transform into a legacy, and I didn't merely survive. I rewrote the conclusion. Not with rage, not with pity, but with grace. It had been several weeks since the funeral when Liv appeared at my door. No call, no text, just a soft knock one Saturday morning as I was watering the spider plant Arthur had once neglected for months. When I opened the door, she looked different. Not disheveled, not distressed, but vulnerable in a way she seldom allowed herself to be. "May I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside without a word. She walked into the living room as if she hadn't spent half her life there. She removed her shoes, sat on the sofa, and stared at the floor for a moment. "I didn't know," she finally said. "I didn't know how strained things were between you and Dad." I sat opposite her, holding my teacup. "I didn't want you to. I thought he was just getting older, working excessively, preoccupied." "He was," I said softly. "And he was also involved with someone else." Her jaw tensed. "Chloe?" I nodded. "Did you know for certain before he passed?" I hesitated, then replied, "I found out. It was painful, but by then, I'd already lost him emotionally." She looked at me, her eyes glistening. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you loved him, and I didn't want to alter that. You deserve to love your father without my pain intruding." She stood abruptly and began pacing. "I wish you'd allowed me to be there for you," she said. "You were always there for me. Every breakup, every late-night call, every scraped knee. And when it concerned you, you remained silent." I observed her for a long moment, because I didn't want you to bear the burden I carried for decades. "But I'm not a child anymore." "No," I said, "you're not, and I'm not broken anymore." That made her pause. She turned and truly looked at me, not as her mother, not as the person who used to pack her school lunches and write reminder notes on small slips of paper. She looked at me as a woman. "You seem different," she remarked. "I am." She sat again, her expression softer now. "I'm sorry, Mom." "I don't need your apology, sweetheart. Just your honesty and your company, if you're offering it." We smiled at each other, and for the first time since Arthur left, since he passed, since the world had tilted on its axis, I felt something solid forming between us again. Not dependence, not guilt, just peace. We talked for hours about her work, her life, what she remembered about her father that still elicited laughter from her. We didn't rewrite the past, we didn't pretend it wasn't painful, but we held space for each other in a way we never had before. That was the nature of pain. It either drives people apart or, if you're fortunate, brings them back together in new, improved ways. When she departed that evening, she hugged me more tightly than she had in years. "I'll come back next weekend," she said. "We'll plant something, perhaps some hydrangeas." I smiled. "I like that. Doit. It has been 4 months since Arthur's funeral. The house feels different now. Not empty, not haunted, just mine." I've rearranged the furniture, moved the sofa to a spot where it receives better light, repainted the bedroom in a pale sage that soothes me, removed the heavy drapes, and welcomed in the sun. In the backyard, beneath the lilac bush, the soil has settled where I buried the necklace. The lilacs are blooming again, fragrant and purple and unapologetically vibrant. I visit them every morning with a cup of tea, not to grieve, just to breathe. I don't think about Arthur every day, but when I do, it's no longer with yearning or anger, it's with recognition. He was a part of my story, but not the entirety of it. He left a scar, yes, but also a space I've now begun to fill with my own choices, my own voice, my own quiet contentment. I joined a book club again. The women are astute and witty, and no one inquires about what my husband does. I've started sketching in the evenings, mostly botanicals and still lifes, simple subjects that feel gentle on the soul. I even submitted an application to volunteer at the local community center. I'm not rebuilding, I'm becoming. Not the version of myself I was before Arthur. Not the woman who spent decades holding things together while simultaneously disappearing. I'm becoming someone new, someone I choose to be. There's a particular beauty in starting anew, not from nothing, but from truth, in being able to say, "This is who I am now," and meaning it without apology. If I've learned anything, it's this. You can lose someone and still discover yourself. You can be erased and write yourself back into the narrative. You can survive the silence, the betrayal, the breaking, and still flourish, not in spite of it, but because of it.